So today we're going to start with the somatic nervous system. And this is the second division of the peripheral nervous system. So if we remember from our previous unit, we spoke about the peripheral unit of the nervous system having two main branches. The branch that we do not voluntarily control, that was the autonomic branch, that's what we covered last week. And then the branch that we do very much voluntarily have control over. This is our skeletal muscles. This is how we laugh and speak and eat and chew and touch things and walk. And we have full control over the somatic branch of the nervous system. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a teaser question here. And let me launch this poll. Okay, so you're going to select the option for the answer choice that you think. I'll give about a minute to complete this one. Okay, so let us see what the options here are. Okay, so 100% of the class said option C, and that's correct, okay? So how many skeletal muscle fibers does a motor neuron typically innervate? And that is many. And that's going to be really important for us to understand the anatomical orientation of the motor unit, okay? So our first objective is to recognize the functional anatomy of the somatic nervous system, and more specifically, what's happening at the neuromuscular junction. So when we look at the anatomy of the somatic nervous system, this brings us to looking at a cross-section of the spinal cord, very similar to what we did for the autonomic nervous system, and speaking about how the fibers of the somatic nervous system arise. Now, first of all, the fibers that innervate skeletal muscle are called motor neurons. So in the somatic nervous system, we don't have that series of two neurons. So we don't have preganglionic neurons, we don't have postganglionic neurons, and we don't have any ganglia. We have one neuron. It goes from the spinal cord and it travels as a continuous neuron all the way out to the skeletal muscle that it's innervating. It's originating from a different part of the spinal cord. So if we recall, the autonomic fibers arose from the lateral horn, so this bulge here, of the cross-section of the spinal cord, whereas the fibers that innervate skeletal muscle, our motor neuron fibers, these originate from the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So a big difference in terms of where these fibers originate. Another big difference is the fact that they innervate skeletal muscle only. So none of our smooth muscle, none of our glandular tissue, none of the voluntary tissues that we talked about last week are innervated by these types of neurons, only muscles that we can voluntarily control. There's only one neurotransmitter involved in the somatic nervous system. That's always and only acetylcholine, and therefore there's only one receptor involved in the somatic nervous system. Again, that is always and only our nicotinic cholinergic receptors, which, if we remember, these are fast receptors because the channel is acting, or the receptor is acting as a channel rather, okay? So a few really important differences about the anatomy of the somatic nervous system, and we can compare and contrast those to what we saw with the autonomic nervous system. Now, the functional unit of the somatic nervous system is called the motor unit, And this is made of a single motor neuron plus all of the fibers that it innervates, okay? And that brings us to a really important rule of thumb with regards to the anatomy of the somatic nervous system. So a single motor neuron can innervate many different muscle fibers, but a single muscle fiber can only be innervated by one motor neuron, okay? And I'll say that again. A single motor neuron, so if we look at our cross-section of the spinal cord here, we're seeing 3 different motor neurons arising here from the ventral horn. We've got one in blue, one in red, and then one here in purple. And each of those motor neurons, as we can see, they're branching to innervate many different muscle fibers. But if we were to look at the perspective of a single muscle fiber, this can only be innervated by one motor neuron. Okay, really important. So one motor neuron, many muscle fibers, one muscle fiber, one motor neuron. And what we'll see here when you look more closely at the structure of the muscle is that we can have many fibers making up the belly or the bulk of a muscle. So each of these individual fibers is acting as a unit because they can be innervated by only one motor neuron. Alrighty. Okay, so let's look more closely at this area that's called the neuromuscular junction. And we're going to start by looking at the events on the motor neuron side. So remember the nerve that innervates the skeletal muscle, we call it a motor neuron. And if we look at the synapse between this single motor neuron and a piece of skeletal muscle, that synapse is what we call the neuromuscular junction. So we're going to start by looking at what happens on the side of the neuron, and then we'll look at the side of the muscle. Now, the activities of the neuromuscular junction are such that we have summation of our graded potentials. And we talked a lot about graded potentials before. We've got EPSPs and IPSPs, which are either excitatory postsynaptic potentials, which open up calcium or sodium channels. And then we've got inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, which we know open up either potassium or chloride channels. And so all of these are being innervated on the soma of this motor neuron. So this is our motor neuron in question. These are the synapses onto the soma of that neuron. And these are the different graded potentials that are being reflected onto this neuron. And so we're going to sum these graded potentials at the axon hillock. Remember, we talked about the axon hillock being a really important region where we have this neural integration. All of these different potentials, all of these different events that are taking place on the soma are summed at the axon hillock, and we decide whether or not we're going to fire an action potential down this neuron, okay? Now, in the event that we do have an overwhelming excitatory event, we trigger an action potential that goes down the length of the motor neuron, and we trigger the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction, specifically down at the distal part of this neuron, which we know to be the axon terminal, okay? And remember, acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter that is involved with neuromuscular events. Let's look at what takes place on the muscle side of the neuromuscular junction. So the synapse is between, again, a motor neuron and a muscle fiber. And down at the terminal bouton or the axon terminal. So here in muscle, we can sometimes call the axon terminal the terminal bouton. This is where we have those voltage-gated calcium channels. And upon reaching the axon terminal, the action potential triggers the opening up of those voltage-gated calcium channels. And we have a sequence of events that involve acetylcholine binding to this nicotinic cholinergic receptor, which is on the side of the muscle. Now, on this side of the muscle, we call this the motor end plate. And this is a specialized muscle membrane at the neuromuscular junction. And we say that it's specialized because it's highly folded. And the reason it's highly folded is to increase the surface area for that action potential to then travel along the muscle and excite the muscle, leading to muscle contraction. Now, all of these motor neurons release acetylcholine, I keep stressing that, and all of the receptors on skeletal muscle are always nicotinic cholinergic. The synapse here is always excitatory. So if I go back to this slide, whereas at the soma of this neuron, we can have graded potentials that are either excitatory or inhibitory. Down at the level of the muscle, at the motor end plate, the synapse here is always excitatory, meaning that we can only contract skeletal muscle. And then we've also got the presence of this acetylcholinesterase, and acetylcholinesterase is important because it helps to clear the neuromuscular junction of any excess neurotransmitter that will help to cease muscle contraction. This becomes even more important here at the neuromuscular junction. If we do not clear the neuromuscular junction of any excess neurotransmitter, then we will continuously have muscles contracting. And we should know that that is not ideal, that is not efficient, that is not ideal. To always have muscles contracting is going against homeostasis and is going to be inefficient for the body. So we want to clear the neuromuscular junction of excess neurotransmitter, and we do so via acetylcholinesterase. All right, so what we're seeing here on the motor end plate is this nicotinic cholinergic receptor. If we remember, this is a fast receptor, so we can see that it's also acting as a channel. And this channel is always excitatory. So when we say that it's always excitatory, it's either going to be flooding sodium in or potassium out, but the net event of this receptor is excess sodium movement into the cell, which is a depolarizing event, right? This is going to depolarize the membrane and lead to a membrane potential, which we call an end plate potential.